Okay, we're going to get started again. This is a panel. We're going to look at three very different approaches, systemic approaches to the durability and susceptibility to change of the energy system. And we're going to start with Amy Stein, who's going to talk about path dependence theory.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for being here, and for, of course, the coordinators and all of my colleagues for engaging in such important decisions and strategies for how we try to decarbonize for our future. So despite significant policy initiatives to promote clean energy, the economics of energy production, as David has pointed out to you, is still driving continued reliance on fossil fuels. Both low oil and low gas prices render it difficult for alternatives to compete, despite all of these efforts. And as countries invest in more natural gas, particularly production, transmission, and generation, the country is committing itself to a long-term relationship with natural gas. The situation just cries out path dependencies to me. And that's not a new concept. It's been around for a long time. But it made me want to learn more about it because it's a little, external to the law. And of course, this interdisciplinary conference lended itself to a perfect place to start thinking about this. So I'm looking at how it can inform our thinking, as many of us are struggling with ways to propel ourselves out of the stickiness associated with fossil fuels and trying to find a more fluid path forward for a decarbonized world. So I think this ties in nicely with John and Mike's work on the pathways and things that we've been talking about. So I'll try to focus only on the new issues so you're not being bored. But let's start with what do I mean by path dependency. There are many variants. People can talk about it in evolutionary terms, rational choice theory, game theory. I'm focusing on the increasing returns path dependence, which has its roots in the economic literature, and it's been used to explain things like the unrelenting market imperfections and the endurance of monopolies. And so increasing returns emerges from four primary characteristics. One is large fixed costs, two is learning effects, the third is coordination effects, and the fourth is adaptive expectations. And when you look at energy and fossil fuel infrastructure, I mean, it just aligns perfectly. The idea is that when all of these are present, a step down the same path has less costs and increased benefits. Whereas to go down a different path, it's going to involve increased costs and uncertain benefits. And so why in the world would you take that new path when there's already been a path paved for you, right? How many of our grandmothers have told us, take the path least less traveled, right? Well, this is not what happens in the path dependency literature. So decision makers may later realize that the choice they made was a suboptimal choice, and they may still remain because they're locked in. The cost of shifting and changing are just too great. So when we look at energy infrastructure, for sure we see this. Large fixed costs. I mean, fossil fuel facilities have long lives. The Keystone XL and that whole controversy might be a great way of sort of thinking about what that would have done in terms of locking us into a pathway for the tar sands, very carbon-intensive fuel in Canada, and bringing it down. For sure, technology lock-ins, thinking about the different standards. One of the ways that this is talked about outside of energy is, the Microsoft and the antitrust disputes. And you sort of have great rewards for the firm that manages to control a standard operating procedure that everyone can apply. Learning effects is the second one. And there it's the idea that the costs are reduced as the product becomes more common. So again, sort of a simple idea. In energy sector, you could think about maybe in terms of, I think Professor Bell is going to talk about, sort of the irony of coal workers being harmed, but then also, why is it that they're still opposing that sort of the move away from coal? And so you might think there are generations of people have been involved in the fossil fuel industry for so long that those are learning effects. They may be reluctant to lose the advantage they have from decades of institutional knowledge and ties on fossil fuels to enter into this uncharted territory. Even when you think about it for public utility commissions, it's more work for them to assess the reasonableness, for instance, of new technologies like energy storage. It's a lot easier of the known quantity of the fossil fuels that have been around a long time. The third one is coordination effects. And then there you can just be thinking about economies of scale, similar to network effects that exist in spades in energy infrastructure. The electricity grid is surely more valuable the more interconnected it becomes. We've seen that played out with the engagement in RTOs, these regional transmission organizations, where we have realized that there are benefits from not going it alone. And the fourth one is adaptive expectations. And here the idea is that, people react in ways that ensure more of the same in the future. So people form their expectations of the future based on what has happened in the past. You can think about how the media informs this characteristic for sure. Talk of fossil fuels being with us long into the future. So if you keep hearing that repeated, and right, this is kind of informing what we expect to happen then in the future. So in thinking about the applicability of path dependency theories, I think we need to remember that it's premised on the idea that we are passing up on new and better things in favor of the status quo. And so I will just be the, sort of devil's advocate and say, can we make sure we all agree that decarbonized resources are better? I think all of us here in this room probably agree, right? But I always am worried about preaching to the choir, and that there are a whole lot of folks out there that might take issue with that, and there are some legitimate reasons. I mean, we could talk about reliability. David definitely touched on reliability a bit there, but our base load sources, the one that provide us the most reliable sources of our electricity, are all fossil fuels. Nuclear is a very strong base load source, but predominantly fossil fuels. And I work with a lot of engineers at University of Florida, and we are trying to figure out how we can best integrate renewables into the grid without jeopardizing reliability. And there are severe problems with those ramps that David was alluding to, that solar is only available at certain times, and wind is only available at certain times. That's very different from our baseload fossil fuel sources that were there 24/7 when you needed them. Similarly, the cost, of course. People could say, this isn't a new path we want to go down because it's too expensive. Why is this a new and better path? Eric thinking about when is it too costly to go green, and those sorts of arguments. So I'm going to put those aside for the moment, but I just want to make sure that we acknowledge that that may be something we have to engage in as well as we think about can we all reach agreement on this, that this is a superior choice. Assuming it is, the next logical question is how can we break these path dependencies? And that was where I was most startled, because when I looked, I just found a whole lot of literature on path dependencies and not as much that seemed to be sort of applicable to how do we actually fix this? Are there ways to break it? And the literature talks about things like there's two primary ways. You can think about outside forces breaking it, the critical junctures that push us towards a new path. You could think of major catastrophes that happen in life. But the second one is the more evolutionary process, which is often through internal forces. And a lot of scholars have talked about a mixture of these forces, and maybe that can lead to a series of path-changing initiatives. And I think that I'm exploring the viability of these both mixture of internal and external forces through three primary mechanisms. One is to facilitate an evolution in the logic applied to energy decisions. The second is to minimize the feedback effects associated with the fossil fuel decisions, and then to, of course, increase the feedback effects associated with clean energy decisions. So what do we mean by that? What is this logic thing I'm talking about? Well, some explain it as institutional path exhibits an identifiable logic, a distinct pattern of constraints and incentives that generate typical strategies, approaches, and shared decision rules that create predictable behavior. When you think about that, oh my goodness, well, there's so much we could do to try to shape that. You've heard a lot already, so let me try to focus on the ones we haven't talked about. One for sure is the shift from supply side to demand side resources. This means, right, the shift from just we're going to construct new power plants every time we think about increasing demand. Instead of that, why don't we talk about what we can do to reduce the demand? So whether that's through energy efficiency matters, whether that is through demand response, which is this idea that entities will actually reduce their energy usage during periods of peak demand in response to an incentive payment. Energy storage. I mean, there's a whole lot that's sort of going on that really may alter the existing relationships. Grid operators, for instance, have been so dependent on utilities for so long that the logic may change if we can sort of get them thinking more about how demand resources are an available substitute for some of these issues. A second way maybe the logic, where there's hope for changing it, is this shift from centralized to distributed. We used to have these big utilities and the big centralized power generators, and the utilities paid for them, and then we would get charged through our rates. But now, if we have a number of customers who are self-supplying, that also changes the dynamics and maybe the logic. Does this make people, they're more empowered? Will they be more proactive, and they're feeling that they want to generate their own electricity? Other ways we could maybe shift the logic include thinking about developing nations, because sometimes we're just too focused here. Happily, this morning we have not been thinking a lot about comparative law and what internationally other institutions are doing, but realistically there are like 1.3 billion people without power across the world. And so, you know, as these countries increase their costs, their standards of living, that means that we have a chance to maybe shape those paths from the beginning that we don't have here. And so if there's going to be a massive electrification over the next few decades in places like Africa and Asia, then maybe that can help shift our logic. If we're seeing, whoa, they're doing things there, well, how is it we can't be doing those things? And there's a lot of complications there. A fourth way we can maybe shift the logic would be climate change, hoping that this was going to maybe be one of those critical junctures we've been watching, and I'm not sure if that's going to be enough to push us off our path. You know, there's a chance, I think, that it's impacted by the political actors and the interest group regime that we've been talking about. Professor Kahans has some interesting research about how no amount of data you can throw at people is going to change their mind about climate change. The only way you can get at it is from hearing about it from someone within your tribe. That you have to sort of hear it from someone you trust and believe in, and that's going to be the only way to sort of mobilize us in getting a broader consensus. A last area of how maybe we could change the logic lies in demographics. Because I do think that, you know, 75 million baby boomers are on the verge of retirement. And what do you think those folks care about in their retirement savings and their, you know, retirement packages for their 401k? Many of them were built upon fossil fuel investments. And so there may be significant reluctance to move to a different path if that, you know, even every individual's self-interest may be participating in retaining the old logic. But what's going to happen when sort of all of you are investing in your 401ks? And I think that the next generation has a different perspective on this. You know, people get excited. My students are always talking about the clean tech industry and what can I do to be working in there. And so as the portfolios start to include more cleaner, decarbonized energies in the packages, that may also be able to help us in this logical shift. How am I doing on time? Okay. So 2 other things we can do, I told you, was 1, to reduce the positive feedback effects for fuels, for fossil fuels. So there, again, I'm kind of like on the ground trying to think about how we can do this. And one I keep thinking about is maybe shortening our license periods. Because these infrastructures have such a long lifespan, you know, often 40 years, and then they're up for renewal, and we'll give them another 40 years, and a lot of times they end up sort of exceeding their usefulness of when they were most efficient and emitting the least amount of the pollutants that David was talking about. It's a lot easier for folks to seek relicensing than to try to cite a new project. Okay, that would be one. Second one would be eliminate the grandfathering that exists in so many of our environmental laws. We have something called new source review, and the rules are set such that there are incentives to keep your old plant operating for as long as you can. Because as soon as you sort of trigger a major modification or a new source, you're going to be subject to more stringent standards. So why do we have things like that that are going to perpetuate the path that we're maybe trying to get off? A third example of how we could try to reduce the positive feedback effects for fossil fuel would be thinking through regulatory mechanisms to make it more expensive, right? These are just the obvious ones. The Clean Power Plan is getting all the attention, but remember that EPA before that was regulating greenhouse gases from new sources. And there, it had ratcheted up the standards so much that it was basically all the criticisms is it's pushing coal out, because the only way you can comply with the new standards standards is carbon capture and sequestration, which we don't really have a lot of right now, and it doesn't look so great on the horizon. And so thinking about environmental regulations as this tool, again, in general, they just operating plants, a large part of environmental regulations is to try to internalize the externalities. Maybe increasing royalty rates, that if you're going to be, digging on national lands for oil and gas, that right now there are pretty, respectable royalty rates that they're paying to the federal government, but what if those were increased so that they were going to be paying a larger share? Would those help sort of shift the path? The bigger issues, of course, fall into that category as well, like eliminate the subsidies and, the cost of carbon. But as Eric and others have noted, these sound good in theory, but are often unlikely in sort of our current state of affairs and the current interest group landscape. So the last approach would be the flip side, right? Instead of trying to provide more positive, reduce the positive feedback mechanisms for fossil fuels, let's try to increase the positive feedback mechanisms for clean energy. And I think there we've probably spent a lot of time already, but more investments in the clean energy. Also patience in the short term, like realizing the payoffs might always not be immediate. I think we have a real problem between short-term and long-term perspectives on these issues. And I would just sort of conclude with thinking about how this deep investment in fossil fuel physical infrastructure, which is where most of my comments were focused, it's coupled with the less discussed, but just as entrenched legal and regulatory infrastructure surrounding energy. And so making a choice to invest in fossil fuels puts in place a set of corresponding institutions. And those institutions often encourage the choice to be sustained. And so this is where I think I really want to focus as I developed my paper. But, thinking through things like public utility commissions and utilities. What are the decision rules that bind them? Sometimes there's statutes that are making it such that the PUC really can't make decisions that get off the path. We have public utility decisions where they treat renewable portfolio standards as a ceiling. The Nevada Public Utility Commission could not, they held that Nevada Energy could not show that renewables were necessary. They were an unjustified price increase because they would have resulted in an amount of renewables that were above the RPS that was required by the state. So you have things like that. Least cost dispatch, which has already been discussed. Some charge that the Clean Power Plan is actually changing us to an environmental dispatch model. But, is that so bad? Maybe we have to sort of start thinking about different ways that we could have a set of rules. Order 1000 tried to do that for transmission. Thinking about other public policy concerns now need to be considered. Cost recovery mechanisms. These are all the nitty-gritties of sort of the rate-making process. Hawaii is actually trying two different rates of return. One for sort of the fossil fuels world, that's going to be a smaller rate of return, then you'll get a higher rate of return if you invest in the new technologies. Stranded costs, which I think some of our other panelists are going to talk about. But also thinking, right, if this is how do we change the institutional paths, the way we approach problems. Even we have a regulatory contract that binds so much of this. And everything, should utilities be able to include distributed generation as in a rate base? If the utility puts the solar panels on your house, should we allow that to be in the rate base? The risk assessments need to really be reevaluated. We have an organization called NERC that's in charge of our reliability of our bulk energy grid, and we don't have any flexibility on what goes into those risk assessments, like the reserve margins. They have been set in place for a long time, and maybe we need more flexibility to adjust. All of this can result in skewed risk assessments in general. A lot of literature is out there showing that public utility commissions in general are risk averse. And so they can favor fossil fuel decisions even when it may be a riskier decision. It still is something they know. This was in part fueled one of the ideas and theories behind why the Florida Public Utility Commission was recently approved an investment in Oklahoma gas fields. And this is now proving to be, I think they've cut their estimates for how much this was going to save ratepayers already by 50%. It was not a fabulous investment. But this continued focus on natural gas makes the public utility commissions feel like, well, who's going to fault me for opting with the natural gas side of things, particularly in this environment? Similarly, the relationship to the customers. Distributed generation for sure is changing that. The grid operators need to now, know what's going on in each of our homes. If we're putting up Tesla's new Powerwall at our house, is that going to impact the grid? No, not at one. But what about the clustering effect that's happening in California, where a whole bunch of people are getting electric vehicles because it's all the richy rich part of town, and then guess what? They all come home at 5 o'clock at the same time. And there is now evaluations being done about, is that going to overload the substation? The feeders, can they handle that all at once, that surge? What happens that it's not timed well with the sun just went down? And so if we have all these people that also happen to have solar panels, there's a lot of interdependent issues that we need to change maybe how customers have previously been quite passive in the, acceptance of electricity, and now that's changing. We see examples like Boulder, and they were breaking from Xcel Energy to create their own muni because they didn't want to sort of be bound to the type of electricity that the utility was providing them. Even the old pricing structures that David was talking about, well, kind of when he showed you the little balls and boxes and how it shifted from $8 to $12, well, why don't we just say we should separate out the T&D charge from the generation charge? And so if every one of us pays the same T&D charge for those transmission and distribution lines for having that security. And then if you have your own solar, you've invested money, so of course you're not going to be paying the generation charge as much. And then those who are, I think that would help maybe eliminate some of the fairness issues associated with it. But that's not, I don't hear that discussed as much as let's impose a surcharge. And anything that sounds like a tax gets everybody up in arms. And so maybe trying to equalize the playing field means we have to just think differently about how we approach these problems. So I will leave it there, and I look forward to your thoughts to help me crystallize how we can break some paths and push ourselves down some new ones.
Alex is going to be talking about one methodology for framing those impacts, which is called life cycle analysis.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So the article that this presentation is based on is at a very early stage, so looking forward to getting feedback. And it's an attempt to evaluate the use of life cycle analysis to guide government policies regarding fuels and technologies in the transportation sector. We've been talking about a lot of the electricity sector, and we'll see how they merge. So in the paper, first, define life cycle analysis and explain its use in evaluating the environmental impacts of all stages of a product from production to use to disposal. Then we review the use of life cycle analysis in considering the carbon emissions associated with biofuels, mostly ethanol, which makes up 10% of every gallon of gasoline sold in the United States as a result of federal mandates in the Renewable Fuel Standard. Then the next part of the paper reviews the increasing application of life cycle analysis to electric vehicles. And this analysis compares the greenhouse gas emissions and other pollution and environmental harms associated with internal combustion engine vehicles and electric vehicles. And not surprisingly, the environmental impacts of electric vehicles driven in regions with low carbon electricity are far less than those of electric vehicles driven in coal-intensive regions. And the use of EVs, electric vehicles, in coal states may be worse for the environment than driving conventional vehicles, at least today, as some conclude. And then the last section of the paper looks at what we should do with this type of life cycle analysis in terms of policymaking in the transportation sector. So I'll give you my conclusions up front, and then I'll explain how I got there. So I end up concluding that life cycle analysis seriously calls into question the legitimacy of the federal renewable fuel standard. And this is not shocking. A lot of people have reached this conclusion as well. Many of the assumptions that led to the creation of that policy in 2005 and its amendments in 2007 are really no longer valid today, if they ever were. And we can use life cycle analysis to attempt to maybe develop a better policy if we start from scratch. There's not a lot of hope that technology or economics are going to fix the problem using the current federal mandates for ethanol. With regard to electric vehicles, I actually reach a different conclusion. I think their life cycle analysis applying to electric vehicles may need to lead to an initial conclusion to incentivize EVs in some states and disincentivize them in others based on how green that state's electric grid is. But I actually think that's a premature conclusion. The country, the whole country, even historically coal-based states are going through a major transition. There's rapid technological and economic developments, David talked about a few of those, that is decreasing the use of coal in the electric grid nationwide. So I think there are reasons to encourage the development of electric vehicle technology and electric vehicle infrastructure, looking ahead to a greener grid and with the potential for much deeper decarbonization. So I think today's life cycle analysis should not necessarily be dispositive on present day electric vehicle policy, because there I think we have a greater potential for positive change and the need for the incentives to get there. So for those of you not familiar with life cycle analysis, it's used as a tool to assess the environmental impacts of a product or a process or an activity through its entire life cycle, from the extraction of raw materials to processing to transport, use, and disposal. And in the early days, it was primarily used for product comparisons, to compare the environmental impacts of disposable and reusable products, let's say. Today, its applications include government policy, strategic planning, marketing, consumer education, process improvement, and product design. So first, let's look at the use of life cycle analysis with regard to biofuels. So for decades, the United States has supported the development of alternative liquid fuels, primarily biofuels, as a substitute for gasoline in the transportation sector. And the goals of promoting biofuels were to reduce the air pollution emissions associated with the combustion of gasoline and vehicle engines, to lower transportation fuel prices, to increase energy security, and reduce our dependence on foreign oil. So these goals resulted in Congress enacting the Renewable Fuel Standard in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which created some large mandates in terms of blending renewable fuels into the nation's gasoline supply. And in 2007, in the Energy Independence and Security Act, Congress significantly increased those mandated amounts, so to 9 billion gallons of renewable fuels in 2008, going up to 36 billion in 2012, but then including a cap on corn ethanol. So corn ethanol is supposed to level out, and then increasing use of advanced biofuels and cellulosic ethanols. And the reason for this new policy in 2007, calling for the reduction in corn ethanol and increases in other forms of biofuels, was because of the use of life cycle analysis. So increasingly, life cycle analysis studies of ethanol in the 2000s determined that once you took into account the greenhouse gas emissions and other air and water pollution associated with turning grassland and forest land into corn crops, the emissions associated with the electricity needed to convert corn into liquid fuel, mostly which is done in the Midwest, which is very dependent on coal. And then you had the transportation emissions associated with transporting the fuel from ethanol facilities to blending locations. The greenhouse gas emissions and other pollution from corn ethanol approached or exceeded that of gasoline. So for the first time in 2007, Congress required the use of life cycle analysis in federal transportation policy and put this cap on the use of corn ethanol, and then increasing mandates on other forms of ethanol. And so you see the different colors are the different types of ethanol that is supposed to increase starting in 2012, and corn ethanol is supposed to level off. Well, that is not what has been happening. There are problems with the renewable fuel standards, lots of problems. Corn is cheap, it's easy to turn into ethanol. A market has not developed for cellulosic ethanol. A lot of our advanced biofuels with lower greenhouse gas emissions come from sugarcane ethanol from Brazil. And we now know that life cycle analysis of corn ethanol, which makes up almost all of our domestic ethanol supply, arguably doesn't provide any environmental benefits with regard to climate change, even if it does burn cleaner in the engines itself. Also, 40% of the US corn crop now goes to fuel production. This means less corn for food, resulting in increased food prices in the US and worldwide. Another problem is a lot of the assumptions, the other assumptions underlying the RFS, are really no longer valid. We're not as dependent right now on we're not as worried about our dependence on foreign oil. The fracking boom started right at the time that the 2007 amendments were enacted. We've got a lot of domestic oil right now, and it's cheap, and oil prices are low, and they're expected to stay that way for quite a while. Now again, this might be okay if there was a market for advanced biofuels and for cellulosic ethanol, but so far these technologies and these markets have not really advanced despite a decade of mandates and subsidies. They might still, but keep in mind the mandate is on the oil companies to blend these amounts, but it's the biofuels industry that has to create these markets and create the new technology. So it doesn't really work as traditional technology forcing regulation that we see in other areas of environmental law. Finally, there are significant uncertainties in the application of the RFS. The EPA is in charge of raising or lowering those amounts. They have statutory authority to do so, and they're starting to do that. They're starting to lower these amounts. It's a labor-intensive process. Regardless of what decision they make every year, and they have to make this decision every year, they get sued, either by the biofuels industry on the one hand, or the oil industry and engine manufacturers in the food industry on the other. I'm sure they hate being involved in this process. So, what should we do? I think we should use life cycle analysis and changing economic conditions with regard to domestic oil production to either get rid of the renewable fuel standard or revise it. It really shows that our current biofuels policy is not sustainable. The other problem is Congress incorporated life cycle analysis into an existing biofuels mandate, and it just didn't really work. The statute became very difficult to administer, and we couldn't really go back on the mandates for corn ethanol. Basically, the RFS starts to look just like a massive subsidy to corn states. And maybe it always was. Lots of people have argued that. But it had environmental advocates in its corner, at least for a while. Those have really gone away. So oil may be bad. We may want to move away from petroleum, but it's really not clear that ethanol is any better. So I think this is an example where life cycle analysis is helpful in exposing flaws in federal policy and maybe can become part of the solution to modify that policy. One option would be for the federal government or other states to go the way of California, which has adopted a low carbon fuel standard which mandates reductions in life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from all fuels, not just focusing on the biofuel sector. So if done well, we could maybe use life cycle analysis to look at transportation fuels more generally, rather than having mandates for particular types of fuels. So that's the discussion on transportation fuels. Then the next part of the paper looks at vehicles. So application of life cycle analysis to vehicles is a newer phenomenon because until recently we haven't really had a lot of alternatives to internal combustion engine vehicles. But although it's still slow, there's been a real uptick in the availability of electric vehicles over the last 10 years. We've got the Tesla, we've got the Nissan Leaf, we have other EVs, we've got plug-in hybrids, and federal and state policies are heavily promoting electric vehicles. So there's a $7,500 federal tax credit for purchases, and then pretty significant additional state tax credits in a lot of states. So then the question is, are electric vehicles always environmentally superior to traditional vehicles? Now, of course, if you just compare vehicle tailpipe emissions, the EV always wins. They don't have any tailpipe emissions. That's easy. But once you apply a life cycle analysis, it gets more complicated. And there are questions as to whether we should continue to incentivize electric vehicles across the board. So nationwide, coal provides a little less than 40% of electricity generation. 10 years ago, it is 50%. I think these numbers are 2014. The numbers is even lower now. It's gone down a lot more. And on a nationwide basis, many studies say that electric vehicles still win over almost all internal combustion engine vehicles with regard to air pollution. But on a regional basis, that is not necessarily the case. And in coal-heavy states, EVs may cause quite a bit of harm from air pollution. So this looks just at CO2 emissions by type of fuel. And more often, we end up comparing coal with natural gas, because we're looking just at the electricity sector. We're not very often comparing coal and gasoline, but you see gasoline is quite a bit lower than coal. This shows the same thing. And then David will like this slide because it doesn't just focus on carbon emissions, but it looks at different types of pollutants by comparing natural gas, oil, and coal. And of course, even though natural gas is far superior to the others, coal, there's still a lot more different types of pollutant emissions than there is as compared to oil. So there's a study in 2015 by a group of economists that converted pollution statistics in every US county to a dollar cost impact and then charted the damage throughout the United States. Now, not surprised, just so you know, in these next set of slides, green is good, red is bad. Internal combustion engines cause the most costs in terms of health damages in densely populated urban areas. This is what you would think, right? New York City, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Chicago. Because it's in these locations you have the worst impacts from concentrated tailpipe emissions. But in the rest of the nation, the impacts were far less. For EVs, it all depended on how much coal was used in the grid for that state. So damages associated with electric vehicles in coal-heavy states, they found were as high as the damages from internal combustion vehicles driven in highly concentrated urban areas. So this I don't know how easily you can see this, but this is showing internal combustion engine vehicles. And so the bad areas are in cities, right? You see where the cities are. Rest of the country, they say, not so bad. When you're talking about electric vehicle damage, basically the West is a much greener grid, lots of hydropower, natural gas, much less coal, and the East, much heavier on coal. So then the study goes on, and they look at the economic value of subsidizing electric vehicles. And they end up concluding, this is where, so red is where you have damages from electric vehicles, and in fact, you should tax them. And green is where you may want to subsidize them. So they concluded that electric vehicles warranted a subsidy or a tax incentive in most of the Western states, where the grid is powered mostly by hydropower and natural gas. They also found subsidies were worth it in some of the dense urban areas with clean grids. But in the rest of the country, particularly in the Midwest, they concluded that electric vehicles should not be subsidized and in many cases should be taxed. So they found on a per mile or per county basis that EVs cause slightly more damage than regular vehicles nationwide, and a subsidy was only warranted in 12 states. Now their ultimate policy, their ultimate conclusion was that the best policy was a per mile pollution fee based on vehicle type and geography, but they recognize that's not going to happen. So these were their second best policies based on the regional carbon intensity of the electric grid with subsidies in some locations, taxes in others. Now, there's another study that came out in 2005. This is by the Union of Concerned Scientists. They did a similar analysis, but they had a much rosier conclusion in terms of the benefits of EVs. There are still regional differences, so what they're comparing is how fuel efficient a vehicle, an internal combustion vehicle, do you have to drive to have the equivalent of an EV? And you see that EVs, of course, are much better in these states, 94 miles per gallon, less so in the Midwest, but still overall looks pretty good for EVs. And they found that EVs were virtually always better than internal combustion engine vehicles. Now, one difference between these two studies, the Union of Concerned Scientists study focused on benefits by population rather than by geography. You have a lot more people living in states with clean grids, California, certain parts of the East Coast, than in coal-heavy grids. That's a lot of land mass, but not as many people driving cars. The Union for Concerned Scientists study also looked at the environmental impacts of energy extraction, so oil extraction and refining, which is then going to increase the environmental harms of internal combustion engine vehicles in addition to their tailpipe emissions. The other study didn't do that. This study also focused more on what the electric grid might look like in the future, with significant increases not only as natural gas substituting for coal, but also increased wind and other renewable energy. The Economist study that I talked about earlier assumed that any retirement of coal plants would be replaced solely by natural gas. Okay, I'll leave it on this slide for a moment. There have been a few broader life cycle analysis studies of electric vehicles. to include the emissions associated with the environmental impacts of electric vehicles at the manufacturing stage, the use stage, these are all use stage studies, and disposal stage. And the main difference is the battery used in an electric vehicle as compared to a traditional vehicle. So focusing on the lithium-ion batteries to increase the stored energy and the range of the vehicle. There were some concerns about increased toxic metals and aluminum and some of the health-related impacts with regard to that. The data in this area is much more limited, but most studies have found that these manufacturing, battery, and disposal-related impacts are only about 2 to 15% of total life cycle emissions. So the real focus is on the use phase, the emissions associated with extracting oil and coal and natural gas, the emissions associated with generating electricity in the case of EVs, and the tailpipe emissions in the case of internal combustion engine vehicles. All right, so what should we do with all of this new information? I don't think we should start taxing electric vehicles in the Midwest or eliminating the electric vehicle subsidies in those areas, even though you can use some of these life cycle analysis reports to justify that. The grid is changing very quickly. This is just some of the backup data from the Economist report. I'll skip over that. We got a lot of wind in the Midwest and in other areas, and we're increasingly starting to use it. Current installed wind power capacity is going up, 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 already very, very big in Texas, big in these Midwestern states that are very, very coal heavy as well. So this series of slides, National Public Radio did some nice state-by-state comparisons from 2004 to 2014 of the changing uses of energy resources for the electric grid. So coal is red. You see coal drastically going down over these 10-year periods in most states. You look at Alabama, you look at Colorado, look at Delaware. They probably just had to close one plant to do that. Georgia. And of course, there's lots of states like Idaho that use mostly hydropower. They haven't had, and now they're doing more on renewables. They haven't used coal in a long time. But even Indiana, Iowa, these are sort of coal-heavy Midwestern states, big increases in wind energy in Iowa. You're not going to see a lot of changes in Kentucky, in West Virginia, places like this that has a significant coal industry that they want to protect. These states are going to look like this for a while. But that's not true in the rest of the country. And even look at North Dakota. North Dakota is a big coal state. They've got a big lignite coal industry that they want to protect, but they also have a huge amount of wind, and even though they don't care about the wind, Minnesota has a pretty strict RPS, and it's much cheaper to build the wind facilities in North Dakota and transmit it in. So even in states like North Dakota, you're seeing these big, big declines. And there's other environmental benefits in increasing electric vehicle use nationwide. It's going to spur development of the charging station infrastructure. Where's that charging station infrastructure going to happen? In these dense urban areas, many of which have cleaner grids, where EVs already seem to be more clearly superior to internal combustion engine vehicles. So unlike the ethanol example, I think this is an area where we're seeing very rapid technological and market changes. Natural gas prices are pretty low. They're likely to remain low. We're not building new coal plants. Wind and solar are on the rise. They're dropping in cost. So I think there's benefits to incentivizing electric vehicle use despite life cycle analyses today that may say they're not always beneficial at the current time. But I think if we look to the future, there are reasons to incentivize EVs now, even though we might not see the benefits until later. I'll end there.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you to Liz and the other people who made the occasion possible. There's social theory tucked away towards the end of the subtitle of what we're doing here, and I want to do a sort of minute's riff on what that might mean. So with a problem as huge as the one that this symposium is addressing, the kinds of answers that one comes up with will depend on where one thinks the points of intervention are, how one defines what counts as a, quote, driver, unquote, that one can manipulate, and what not. And from that point of view, to me, it's striking that although we're sitting in the law school, the position of law and the kinds of things law cares about have been rather under the carpet. So the metaphor of silver buckshot is perhaps not the highest and greatest idea of the law that we might come up with, but we've heard, for instance, a lot about fairness and not a great deal about justice. And, one may therefore wonder at what analytic level we're even slotting in something like the law and its functions. What we have heard about enormously much is economics and the market. I mean, so cost has been the paramount word, in a sense, either explicitly or implicitly, that's driven a lot of the talk. And there's been a sort of implicit sense that the role of the law is to facilitate the market, and that the market will then achieve the right sorts of results. And within that system, it's interesting to me that the things that are considered most fixed in a way and not worth thinking about are us, people. That is, Dan Kahan's rather impoverished sense of what the human mind is capable of. We buy whatever's given to us in the media, and that's we are. But why are we here? Why are we talking to each other? I mean, presumably there's a sense that how you reason and in what terms you reason, how you think, what your ideologies are about the kinds of societies and futures you want to develop actually do count. And from that point of view, taking interest groups as given in advance in the way that Eric Beaver's research project seems to take them, or as manipulable through something called policy, which would be music to the ears of my school, the Kennedy School. But, one wonders, I mean, is it people that drive policy or policy that drives people? I mean, those are kind of deep-seated questions that social theory might begin to have an idea about. Let me present a somewhat different view of where one might start that takes people and their ideas and how they think and how they make those thoughts come into being as somehow the centerpiece of our analytic attention. So, in thinking about the transition to an energy future, I have been struck at the repeated use of the word harnessing in talking about the things with which we make energy. And it was explicitly in President Obama's first inaugural address. This is the sort of thing that people refer to when they say our president is capable of soaring rhetoric. How many of you have heard that phrase? So we'll restore science to its rightful place. This was music to the ears of all of my climate science and other scientific friends. Wield technology's wonders to raise healthcare's quality and lower its cost. But then we will harness the sun and the winds and the soil to fuel our cars and run our factories. So back of many of the cases that have already been discussed is this idea that we're going to harness elements of the earth to do our bidding. And that is a promise, and it's worthwhile for social theorists to ask, how is that harnessing of bits and pieces of the earth actually going to come about? What is involved in that harnessing? And in the promise, all this we can do, all this we will do. And one of the things that is kind of axiomatic for social theory is to say, whenever somebody says we, ask who the we is, because therein lies a conundrum often. So we can look historically, now we in this room, at our own past in thinking about all this harnessing and stuff that's going to go on, because energy transitions, as I think Greg pointed out right from the start, have been with us, as part of our mindset for a long time. So this is a well-known quotation from an early proponent of nuclear power, Louis Strauss, who was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission when the Atoms for Peace program was being brought into being. And what is best known from that larger quotation is the idea of electrical energy too cheap to meter. So nuclear power was supposed to achieve this. It was supposed to be the endpoint. Well, I mean, electrical energy, as we know, has not become too cheap to meter. And one can ask what the fate of nuclear power has been in different countries. The German example has already come up a few times, and I want to approach it from a different angle, as I'll say in a moment. So an STS scholar, somebody in my field of science and technology studies, would point out that this is a very friction-free image of progress and the world, and that it fits in with certain collective imaginations of what modernity is supposed to bring for us. So an idea of progress as being linear, always on an uphill slope, always getting better and better, tied to efficiency, costs always going down, and technological processes that seem to articulate that vision. We didn't get to 300 million cars, or whatever the number is, just accidentally. Somebody decided that cars had to get cheaper, ideally, and we had to develop an industrial process, and at least one of us is from Michigan and well knows the consequences, the life cycle impact of those sorts of decisions. Accessibility, that everybody should have access. There is a justice idea that's converted into economics. Eradication, that we would get rid of things. And note that even in today's idea of progress, the zero carbon future, this eradication idea is very powerfully built into the imaginary. And then all of this was going to be transparent and clean and see-through and visible to everybody, that kind of notion. There would be no backroom dealings. Everything would be rational as science itself. Well, in this book, which has recently come out, all of the authors and I myself take a somewhat different view of how these social imaginaries work and how embedded they are in the nitty-gritty details of how one goes about harnessing the earth. And we have a couple of definitions there, but the things that we stress in the couple of definitions of socio-technical imaginaries that have been advanced to date is that the powerful thing is what kinds of futures are people looking towards. My own research has been at the national comparison level, but this does not have to be about nations. In fact, it can be about any other kind of collective. It can be about social movements, for instance, and they need not be top-down imaginaries. They can be bottom-up. They can coexist in different nation states and be in contestation. But the key thing is that these are animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order, and moreover, that these are founded in visions of what one can do with science and technology. So from that standpoint, if one goes back historically and looks at the first thing that we tried to harness, here is a DOE image of a whole website in which they talk about how to teach about harnessing the atom. Note how clean it is. I mean, there are no people, there are no forces, it's just molecular diagrams. But if you look at the first atomic bomb, you see that already, even in its workings, I mean, that is actually a kind of nice image to put beside the Christo's image of planet Earth wrapped up, if some of you know it from approximately the 1989 cover of Time magazine. But in any case, it begins to show you the complexity of taking that atom and actually making it into stuff. It's complicated. The wiring is messy. And, here is an early atom smashing unit. And you see that getting that atom to do your bidding, our bidding societally, requires us to build, layers upon layers of stuff to make these things happen. And those layers have strange consequences. So this is a post-Fukushima march in Germany, but what's interesting about it is all the different messages that are being brought to bear together. I mean, it is rather remarkable that Fukushima should trigger this kind of anxiety in Germany, which is after all not given to having tsunami risks and earthquake faults running down it. It has some other risks and some other faults, but you notice there in the bottom right the famous logo of the Atomkraft Nein Danke, which has been, so atomic power, no thank you, which has been a logo in Germany, a mobilizer for a very long time. And then Fukushima falls upon a territory made by people and their ideas and their discourses and their movements, all of which are part of that infrastructure. Then it's not just the grid, it's not just the atom, it's not just the power plant. It is an entire set of public habits, public discourses, what people are used to doing and how they do it. And just calling it an interest group doesn't quite capture the mobility and the dynamism of these movements and the way in which they move from issue to issue and reframe issues as they go along. So let's talk about harnessing some other things, not just the atom. This is a progressive article from Slate about the Solyndra scandal that many of you know about, but what the Slate article says is that the scandal is really how good it's been and not how bad it's been. So it's been obviously picked up by the Republican Party as a failed idea of technology policy. And this article says, but look, what has happened is that because of that public investment, thanks in part to the Energy Department-backed projects, the price of building such plants has fallen. Well, the other day I was in a meeting where a guy from Solar City was talking about the wonderful success that his company is having selling renewables. And one of the things he pointed out is that they're occupying the Solyndra plant, which is a dead and, abandoned building, right? So what do we make of this? I mean, it fits within the kind of research that I've been doing with the demonstration that we as a society rely on the public sector to pick up the early risks of development, as we did, for instance, with the Price-Anderson Act in underwriting the risks of nuclear power, and then the benefits we hand over to the private sector. So if we sink $500 million of costs in Solyndra, and Solar City takes over the bankrupt company's plant and uses it, the dollars haven't gone away. The public sector, that is us as taxpayers, have absorbed the cost that is now underwriting the private sector's rush into business. So we can appreciate the fact that the market is doing things, but we could also ask the justice-injustice question of how we do the accounting of who bore the costs and who is bearing the benefits. Without capital, you don't get to be the private sector that is capitalizing on those earlier sunk costs. So if we're continually, as a society in this country, saying risk public, benefit private, that is a major piece of our imaginary, and we're ignoring the fact that the market rests on a fundamental notion of justice that says if it's costs, we share it, but if it's benefit, the wealthy get to capitalize on it because they have the capital to go ahead and do that. So I think maybe that is the real Solyndra scandal, and not either of the two other ones that are being bruited about. What about harnessing the wind? Well, we have had lots of worries in this country, but the worries in this country are about particular concerns that Americans have. The NIMBY syndrome has been quite popular in thinking about harnessing wind power. Now, of course, everybody who loves renewables is tempted to look indeed across the ocean and say, well, why can't we be like Germany? And John Dernbach, I think, referred to this. I think it was you, John, when you said how extraordinary it was that you could be sitting in this meeting in Paris and everybody from Germany is nodding in unison at the, that was in your talk, right? So everybody's buying in. I mean, of course, we live in a pluralist society where we believe strength comes from not buying in, so one might actually wonder about this system in which everybody is buying in. But interestingly, this very, very recent article, like 18th of February, it was made for us, says the main driver is the Energiewende, which is the energy transition. And it says that when it started, the energy transformation was quite controversial and only gained broad social and political support in 2011 after the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan. Well, this person, although she has a German name, is working in the US, and maybe her understanding of history is therefore like ours. If it happened yesterday, then you forget it, and history began today. But it's not with the Fukushima disaster that the German set of attitudes begins at all. The German imaginary of what is at risk and what is at stake. I mean, why are the Germans concerned about Fukushima? That deserves a deeper kind of explanation. And one can look at the beginnings of Germany's own imagination of what is involved in climate, in the climate change disaster as it's looming. One would have to go back at least to post-war Germany and Reconstruction and ask oneself seriously, how do post-war Germans conceptualize disaster? And there's a whole literature that I don't have time to go into right now about Germany's coming to grips with that period of post-war reconstruction in which civilization as Germans knew it, and Germans, of course, considered themselves one of the custodians of Western civilization, that this was utterly and completely destroyed. It's been written about how little writing there is about the immediate 3 years following the war, in which Germany was reduced to rubble on every level. Not just material, not just physical, but also psychological and mental. And this is a kind of big taboo. It requires psychological analysis of a sort that I can't get into, but it is a part of German memory and German understandings of what a disaster is. And it's well known that Germany coined for itself the term climate catastrophe, a term that's still widely used. The first time it was publicly introduced into the literature was on the cover of Spiegel magazine. And it is not accidental that it is Cologne Cathedral sitting in the ruins that becomes the collective emblem through which Germany is reimagining what will happen if another civilization-breaking disaster, namely climate change, comes into being. And I think that this is all wrapped up in the German imaginary of collective risk and collective benefit, and makes that society prepared to put up with monetary sacrifices of a sort that Americans would have a lot more trouble dealing with, at least until we face images and ideas that are comparably threatening to our collective well-being. Okay, so harnessing the soil, you've heard a nice recap of our own biofuels reform, but it's well to remember that the EU has its own scandal relating to the wrong policy. And I think that indeed the life cycle analysis kind of perspective gives us one way to address this question of at what level do we approach the analysis. But again, it may not be entirely deep enough, because it's not just the efficacy of the biofuels as a fuel substitute and as a renewable energy package, but also how biofuels relate to other systems of production. And here from the discussion of the recent European policy move, again cutting back on the amount of biofuel contribution, there is a glancing reference to it. It emerged, some did more harm than good to the environment, according to the European Commission, but among the things that it did, as people know very well, is that it affected crop plant production, and people have used rhetoric like, we're taking our food and dumping it into our gas tanks. But there again is a justice implication. because whose food is being taken for whose fuel tanks? The people who are using the biofuels are not usually the ones who are suffering the hunger. The hunger is being suffered elsewhere, where those crop plants would have contributed to basic commodity grains for a population. And I'm worried that with something like life cycle analysis, we may lose sight of the much more layered embedding of our technical assessment protocols and procedures in a set of social formations that reach much deeper down. Imaginaries as a tool for rethinking how it is that we arrive at collective ideas of the future prompts us to think about politics itself in perhaps a different way. So not, we already have the market and we therefore understand politics, and politics gets driven by good markets, therefore let's make good markets. I have nothing against that line of attack and that line of analysis. We should develop rational policy choices. But one should keep in mind that whatever it is that we're choosing to marketize in the first place is a political choice. If we marketize the wrong things, such as biofuels, and have the best possible policies to do the biofuels right, we may still end up with unintended consequences that do not touch the people in this room in the first place. And this is why I would like law itself to become a bit more cognizant of social theory and not settle for the buckshot approach. But keep in mind that the buckshot approach is great if we are confident that we have the right policy framing, and therefore we need the incremental adjustment and the tinkering. But that even Western societies, as close to each other as the US and Germany, have foundationally different ideas of what politics is, what the state should be doing, what the responsibility of public and private sector are vis-a-vis each other, who we are as thinking beings in a state. The German civil law idea about human personality and how it should evolve is quite different from our much more already marketized cost-benefit idea of the utilitarian person and the homo economicus who is going about making decisions. So if I have a wish here, it is that we expand our imaginations to incorporate a richer set of ideas about the role of the human in this future that we were told already in 1987 is supposed to be our common future. So thank you.
I was struck, and by the way, Sheila, the social theory at the end was a Trojan horse, not a second-class designation, just so we're clear. I can't help but look at any of the kinds of methodologies and approaches that we heard about in this panel and elsewhere in my research and teaching, and have any response other than being humbled and being driven to modesty by the limitations of the methods. And the other day in my seminar, we talked about risk assessment versus health risk analysis as two different ways, and as a way of moving away from the kind of technocratic confidence that Sheila was talking about post-World War II to something more manageable, something that actually admits to its limitations. And we see hints of the need for modesty in the discussion of path dependence, which is an issue close to my heart. The first article I ever wrote, I tried to impose path dependence on a social group with mixed success. And but at the time I had the same reaction as you did. It's perfect. It all lines up and everything. But then you get to, but what about change? What about critical junctures? And is path dependence appropriate for this particular setting when much of the economics literature applies it to a limited number of knowledge-based goods? And similarly with life cycle analysis, a very powerful framing tool necessary for us to think about comparatively these energy systems. But at the same time, if you look at any subpart of a life cycle assessment for an area of energy, such as oil sands, and you find that there are 6 different models that are widely accepted to just compare the different modes of transportation of oil sands across North America, whether by rail or otherwise. And so there seems to be a need for modesty, and there seems to be some way in which, at the same time, both of these methods do have room for inclusion of the kinds of imaginaries that Sheila talked about. So I just want to open it up to the panel and ask first to Alex and Amy how you see that kind of incorporation of some of the ideas that Sheila talked about, how that might work, how that might lead to more responsible, more modest application of the methodologies that you brought to bear.
So I think it's very important. So of course, as Sheila mentioned, the food implications with using biofuels not for food and using it for fuel, and I had mentioned that as well. When you're looking at a life cycle analysis, you're looking at health impacts. These are clearly health impacts. You can add all sorts of inputs, but you can't. The whole idea of, well, once you do the life cycle analysis, then you have the answer, I agree, is completely wrong. You need to take into account a much broader set of inputs and then think about what you end up with. So that's why on the electric vehicles, if you just look at a life cycle analysis and a snapshot of time in a particular area, it might lead you to a particular conclusion that's not necessarily the best in the long term. I think that's true for biofuels as well. So that's why I think there's limitations to, for instance, the straight economic analysis that I talked about by the economists on looking at life cycle analysis for electric vehicles and regular vehicles. There's a lot that they didn't take into account, and so those conclusions came out and everyone was all up in arms. It's like, well, let's look behind it. So I think there's a real risk in terms of policymakers just adopting wholesale a particular life cycle analysis. It doesn't always work, but I think it's an important factor that needs to be taken into account, and our scientists and others should be doing more of it, but we have to take it with a grain of salt. I agree with that.
Thanks. Well, I was taking a lot of notes, Sheila, because I thought it was really a nice reminder of why we have conferences like this, because I think sometimes we're just too in our own worlds in each of our disciplines, and it's a really nice reminder, and it made me think of a lot. I mean, I definitely agree with even your comments as well about the move from the technical confidence to something that it's going to be more beneficial if we can admit the limitations of these things, and I've been having conversations with my engineering colleagues about the economic literature and the theories that, markets and that they're going to solve everything. And we are seeing problems. And, my colleague is often the only non-econ person in a room. And he's just been consistently frustrated with what you're describing, the sort of like, well, the theory isn't playing out in practice. And that if we kind of constantly adhere to these theories without acknowledging that they may not always apply in every situation, we're setting ourselves up for just a path of disaster. And I find that if we could all be a little more humble and maybe try to, instead of I know we're naturally advocates, many of us, and so we're trying to advocate for a position, but if we can be more objective in the assessments, pretty much every single issue, we can all go out and find competing tests, competing analyses, competing methodologies that show completely different analyses and different results on almost any issue. I even remember when the Clean Power Plan came out, right? Like the trade press article said, Clean Power Plan jeopardizes reliability, and the next day was, Clean Power Plan will be completely fine for reliability. And it just depends on where you're going to get, you can always find support to justify your ends. And so can we focus more on an objective means, I think might help us.
And secondly, Sheila, your work over many years has a kind of path-dependent story to it. Socio-technical systems have path dependence as one of their features. Do you see this literature as productive in terms of informing the green energy transition?
Well, I don't know, if I take my own possibly most cited article's title seriously, it's called Technologies of Humility. I should not overclaim anything about the capacity of my analyses to do anything at all. But more worth pointing out is that I've occupied a really odd position between high social theory on one side, I mean, people in theoretical fields read my stuff, and a groundedness in the nitty-gritty details of public policy and environmental law that go back to my very first job out of law school as an environmental lawyer. So a couple of books that I wrote in 1985 and 1990 were about improving procedures in an internal way, as they are. I mean, so controlling chemicals was not very different from the kind of analysis that Eric's group is doing for countries. How did they regulate carcinogens? And we also focused largely on structural variables there. And then in 1990, I wrote The Fifth Branch, which was about giving scientific advice, and it was about how to improve that system of giving advice. Well, the criticism that came back, especially of The Fifth Branch, was all that holds only if you don't embed that discussion itself in a bigger political economy. Now, mind you, the people who made that criticism hadn't looked at the nitty-gritty details of how EPA does this or FDA does this, but it helped me to rethink, how I would go about doing the analyses in a different way. In 1996, there was a National Academy, National Research Council report that tried to put some of those ideas into a policy document. And this is the Understanding Risk report for anyone who's interested, and said that there should at least be a recursive process of analysis and deliberation. Now, I mean, obviously it's easy to say, hard to do. When do you have the recursiveness? But at least it points out that the analysis is utterly indispensable in its place, but that it needs to be in a constant conversation with the deliberative politics as well. And then it becomes a question of some importance. When do you toss it back? And deliberative politics in a globalizing world, among whom? Who is at the bargaining table and who is not? And, even these international bodies or intergovernmental bodies may not be giving any kind of voice to population groups inside of major countries, whether Brazil or India or Russia or China, that may have radically different views. So where are this is something the law does well. Procedurally, where are we drowning out and silencing the voices that ought to belong in the deliberation? It's just a kind of question that I think belongs as much on the table as are our markets functioning efficiently where we have constructed them. And I think that the critical question, have we constructed the markets prematurely? Have we defined what the system is that we're pricing in a too narrow way? That goes back to that understanding risk question. It is analytic. Economics is an analytic tool. But if we're not analyzing the right things, then the answer can be as great as it wants to be. It's answering the wrong question. And that is the conversation that I think we need to be having.
Great, and the last hour of today, we can get into some of that much more. But sadly, we have to move on to the next panel, so we'll just break for about 5 minutes and reconvene. Thank you, everyone.